The crack in Jonathan Miller's driveway was supposed to be nothing, just another repair job for a tired mechanic who'd bought a house nobody else wanted. But when his truck broke through the concrete that morning, revealing rusted metal beneath, he had no idea he was about to uncover a secret that had been deliberately buried for decades. What lay beneath would force an entire town to confront the history they'd tried to forget. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this incredible tale has traveled. Jonathan Miller stood at the edge of his new property line, keys heavy in his calloused palm, watching the real estate agent's car disappear down Sycamore Street perhaps a bit too quickly. The autumn wind carried dead leaves across the cracked driveway, and for a moment, just a moment, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Fresh start, he muttered to himself, the words barely audible above the rustling oak trees that bordered the property. At 43, after 20 years of fixing other people's broken cars and nursing his own broken marriage, Jonathan had earned the right to talk to himself. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months ago, and this house, this forgotten, overlooked house on the outskirts of Millbrook, was supposed to be his chance to rebuild. The Victorian-era structure stood before him like a patient grandmother, weathered but dignified, its gray paint peeling in places that suggested stories rather than neglect. 3 stories tall, with a wraparound porch that creaked a greeting when he stepped onto it. The house had been on the market for 2 years. 2 years in a seller's market, which should have been his first warning. Nobody wants that place, his brother Marcus had said over beer the week before. You know there's got to be a reason. The reason is that nobody wants to put in the work, Jonathan had replied, defensive even then. The bones are good, foundation's solid, just need some love. Marcus had given him that look, the same one from when they were kids, and Jonathan insisted on keeping the 3-legged dog they'd found behind the grocery store. You can't fix everything, John. But Jonathan had always believed otherwise. It's what made him a good mechanic, and what had made him stay in his marriage 5 years too long. Still standing here now, with the afternoon sun casting long shadows through the bare branches, he felt something he hadn't felt in years possibility. The front door opened with a groan that spoke of decades without oil. Inside, dust motes danced in the slanted light streaming through tall windows. The hardwood floors, though scuffed and dull, were authentic oak, the kind they didn't make anymore. The staircase curved elegantly despite missing several balusters, and the original crown molding remained intact throughout most of the first floor. Jonathan set his first box down in what would be the living room and pulled out his phone to text his daughter Sarah, who was away at college. Made it to the new place. It's perfect. Missing you already. Her response came quickly, as it always did. Dad, please tell me you at least checked for ghosts. Only the friendly kind, he typed back, smiling. If only he'd known how wrong he was. The first 3 weeks passed in a blur of renovation work. Jonathan threw himself into the project with the kind of single-minded focus that had always been his blessing and curse. Every morning he'd wake at 5:30, make instant coffee in the barely functional kitchen, and map out the day's tasks. Strip wallpaper in the dining room, replace the broken tiles in the upstairs bathroom, sand and refinish the stairs. The work was therapeutic, each completed task a small victory against chaos. His hands, already rough from years of working on engines, developed new calluses from handling sanders and paintbrushes. But he didn't mind. There was something honest about manual labor. Something pure about watching a broken thing become whole again, under your care. It was during these early days that he began to feel the house accepting him, its creaks and settling sounds becoming familiar rather than strange. The neighbors kept their distance at first, watching from behind curtains as he hauled debris to the dumpster he'd rented. Millbrook was that kind of town, polite but wary, especially of outsiders. It wasn't until Mrs. Chen from across the street brought him a casserole that anyone actually spoke to him. Tuna noodle, she said, handing him the still warm dish wrapped in a checkered towel. She was maybe 70, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to catalog everything. My grandmother's recipe. Figured you could use a real meal. That's incredibly kind of you, Jonathan said, genuinely touched. I'm Jonathan. John. I know who you are, Mrs. Chen replied, not unkindly. Small town. We heard someone finally bought the old Hartley place. The Hartley place. She nodded, her expression shifting slightly. something flickering across her features that Jonathan couldn't quite read. The family that built it back in 1892. Of course, they haven't lived here for, must be 40 years now, maybe more. Any idea why the house sat empty for so long? Jonathan asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Chen's pause was just a beat too long. Oh, you know how it is. Big old houses like this, they're expensive to maintain. Not everyone's willing to put in the work. She glanced at his paint-stained hands and smiled. But you seem like the type who doesn't mind getting dirty. After she left, Jonathan stood in his kitchen, eating the casserole straight from the dish, wondering about that pause, that flicker of, what concerned pity? He pushed the thought away. Old towns had their superstitions, their stories. Every house had a history. It didn't mean anything. The driveway had always been an eyesore, a long stretch of concrete leading to the detached garage, spiderwebbed with cracks that had been filled and refilled over the years, with black tar that now resembled some kind of abstract art. Jonathan had planned to deal with it eventually, maybe in the spring when the weather was better for laying new concrete. But the house itself demanded attention first. It was a Thursday night, exactly 1 month after he'd moved in, when he first heard the sound. Jonathan was in bed exhausted from spending the day ripping up the ancient linoleum in the kitchen when something pulled him from the edge of sleep. He lay still listening, trying to identify what had woken him. The house made its usual settling sounds, the tick of cooling pipes. The whisper of wind through the gaps he hadn't yet sealed, but underneath was something else. A scraping sound. Rhythmic, deliberate. He sat up, straining to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from outside, from the direction of the driveway. Jonathan moved to the window, pushing aside the sheet he'd hung as a temporary curtain. The driveway stretched out below, bathed in the silver light of a crescent moon. Nothing moved. The scraping stopped. "Raccoons," he said aloud, his voice strange in the dark room. "Or possums." He went back to bed, but sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, he dreamed of fingernails on concrete, desperate and endless. The next morning, armed with coffee and determination, Jonathan inspected the driveway. He walked its entire length, examining the cracks more carefully than he had before. Near the center, about 20 feet from the garage, one crack seemed wider than the others, maybe an inch across at its widest point. When he knelt beside it, he could have sworn he felt cool air rising from below, carrying with it a mustiness that didn't match the autumn morning. Foundation issues, he told himself, making a mental note to check the basement walls later. Every old house had foundation issues. It was practically a given. But that night the scraping came again. This time Jonathan was ready. He'd left a flashlight on his nightstand, and when the sound started 11:47 p.m. According to his phone, he grabbed it and headed outside in his boxers and t-shirt, not even bothering with shoes. The October air bit at his exposed skin, but he barely noticed. The scraping was louder outside, clearly coming from beneath the driveway. He dropped to his knees beside the wide crack, pressing his ear close to the gap. The sound stopped immediately, as if whatever was making it had heard him approach. Jonathan stayed there for several minutes, knees growing numb against the cold concrete flashlight beam playing across the crack. Nothing. Just as he was about to give up and go back inside, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A whisper. Faint, possibly imagined, but unmistakably human. He jerked back, falling onto his haunches. The flashlight rolled away, its beam spinning crazily across the driveway before coming to rest, pointing at the garage. Jonathan's heart hammered in his chest as he grabbed the light and scrambled to his feet. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The only answer was the wind through the trees and the distant sound of a dog barking several streets over. Jonathan didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat in his kitchen lights, blazing drinking coffee and trying to rationalize what he'd heard. Pipes could make strange sounds. Sometimes underground utilities created odd echoes. There had to be a logical explanation. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant, he was still at the kitchen table, surrounded by empty coffee mugs and half-formed theories. That's when he made his first mistake, or perhaps his first right decision, depending on how you looked at it. He called his brother. "You heard what?" Marcus's voice was thick with sleep and irritation. It was barely 6 a.m. on a Saturday. "I know how it sounds." "It sounds like you're losing it, John. Jesus, I told you not to buy that place." "Can you just come over? Please bring your tools." There was a long pause. Then Marcus sighed the sigh of a younger brother who'd been pulling his older sibling out of questionable situations since childhood. "Give me an hour." Marcus arrived in his pickup tool belt already on carrying 2 cups of decent coffee from the shop in town. He handed one to Jonathan, studying his brother's face with concern. "You look like hell." "Thanks, that's helpful." They stood side by side, staring down at the driveway. In the morning light, it looked utterly ordinary, just old cracked concrete that needed replacing. "So you heard scraping," Marcus said slowly, and then whispering from under the driveway. "I know how it sounds. It sounds like you need more sleep and less instant coffee." But Marcus was already kneeling beside the crack, running his fingers along its edge. "Although, this is weird." "What?" "The crack. Look at the edges." Marcus pulled out his phone, turning on its flashlight for better visibility despite the morning sun. "See how they're worn smooth? That doesn't happen naturally. It's like something's been, I don't know, pushing through repeatedly." Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. "Pushing through from below or above." Marcus stood, brushing off his knees. "Could be the concrete's been patched so many times it's created a weak point. Temperature changes ground, shifting pressure builds up and releases through the weakest spot." It was a reasonable explanation, but Jonathan could tell his brother didn't quite believe it either. They spent the next 2 hours examining the driveway more thoroughly. Marcus had brought a long probe from his truck, and they used it to test the depth of various cracks. Most hit solid ground within a few inches. But the wide crack, the one Jonathan had listened at the probe, went down nearly 2 feet before hitting something solid. "That's not right," Marcus muttered. "There shouldn't be a gap that deep. Not unless—" He stopped, frowning. "Unless what?" "Unless there's something under here, an old septic tank maybe, or a basement extension. Some of these old houses had root cellars built away from the main structure." Marcus was already heading for his truck. "I've got a sledgehammer. We could open it up a bit, see what we're dealing with." Jonathan hesitated. The rational part of him, the part that had kept him functional through the divorce, through the loneliness, through the upheaval of starting over, that part said to leave it alone. Call a contractor. Get a proper inspection. Don't go looking for trouble. But another part, a deeper part, that remembered being a boy who turned over rocks to see what lived underneath, who took apart radios to understand how they worked, who couldn't leave a mystery unsolved, that part was already nodding. "Let's do it." The first blow of the sledgehammer sent a crack racing across the concrete like lightning. The second blow caused a 3-foot section to crumble inward, revealing not dirt or gravel, but darkness. Empty space. The brothers stood at the edge of the hole, staring down. Jonathan's flashlight beam penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed by the black. "Holy shit," Marcus whispered. The hole was roughly rectangular, about 3 feet by 4 feet. The edges showed that the concrete here was only about 4 inches thick, much thinner than the rest of the driveway. Beneath it was a layer of rotted wood, probably plywood, that had given way. And beneath that, Jonathan lay on his stomach, extending his arm with the flashlight as far as he could into the hole. The beam finally found something solid about 8 feet down. But it wasn't dirt, it was metal. Rusted, corrugated metal. "There's something down there," he said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "Something built. Deliberately built." Marcus was already heading back to his truck. "I've got rope and a ladder. John, this could be dangerous. We should call—" "Call who?" Jonathan interrupted. "The police. And tell them what? That there's a hole under my driveway. They'll tell us to call a contractor." Maybe that's exactly what we should do. But Jonathan was already taking the rope from his brother's hands. They'd come this far. He needed to know. It took them another hour to widen the hole enough to fit the ladder. By then Mrs. Chen had noticed the commotion and stood at the edge of her property, watching with an expression Jonathan couldn't read from that distance. He waved, trying to appear casual, as if breaking open one's driveway on a Saturday morning was perfectly normal behavior. The ladder descended into darkness. Jonathan tested it carefully, making sure it was secure against the edge of the hole. The metal rungs were cold under his hands, and as he began to climb down, he felt like he was descending into the earth itself. "Be careful," Marcus called from above, his voice already sounding distant. The temperature dropped noticeably as Jonathan descended. The smell grew stronger, mildew rust and something else, something organic and old. His feet finally touched solid ground, and he stepped back from the ladder, playing his flashlight around the space. He was in a tunnel. No, not a tunnel, a corridor. The walls were corrugated metal, the kind used in bomb shelters, supported by metal beams that had once been painted green but were now mostly rust. The ceiling was just high enough for him to stand upright, and the corridor extended beyond the reach of his flashlight in both directions. "John! You okay down there? You need to see this," Jonathan called back, his voice echoing strangely in the metal space. Marcus descended quickly, a second flashlight gripped in his teeth. When he reached the bottom, he took it out and whistled low. "This is military," he said immediately. "Look at the construction. This is Cold War era, maybe earlier." They moved down the corridor slowly, their footsteps echoing metallically. After about 30 feet, it opened into a larger chamber. Jonathan's flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing details that made his heart race. It was a room perhaps 15 by 20 feet. Metal shelving lined one wall, mostly collapsed now, spilling their contents across the floor. Cans, dozens of them, their labels long since rotted away. Glass jars, some broken, some still intact, filled with unidentifiable dark substances. And in the corner, barely visible under a pile of deteriorated fabric, was something that made both brothers stop in their tracks. A cot. A child-sized cot, its metal frame still intact, despite the decades. And on it, partially preserved by the cool, dry air of the shelter, was a small teddy bear, its one remaining eye reflecting their flashlight beams like a tiny mirror. "Someone lived down here," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan moved closer to the cot, his flashlight revealing more details. There were other items scattered around, tin plates, a few books swollen with moisture damaged their text illegible. A ceramic cup miraculously unbroken with a faded pattern of roses around the rim. And on the wall, scratched directly into the metal with something sharp, were words. "Wait for night. They don't come in the dark. Be quiet. Be small. Mama says soon." The scratches were at different heights, some clearly made by an adult hand, others lower, more childlike in their formation. Jonathan reached out to touch them, then pulled his hand back as if the metal might burn him. "We need to call someone," Marcus said. This is historical, archaeological, something." But Jonathan was already moving deeper into the room, his flashlight having found something else. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an overturned shelf, was another opening. This one had been sealed with a heavy metal door, but the door stood slightly ajar, its locking mechanism long since failed. "John, wait." But Jonathan was already pushing the door open. It moved reluctantly, its hinges screaming in protest. Beyond was another chamber, this one smaller, more cramped. And it was here that the true story began to reveal itself. The walls were covered in paper newspapers, photographs, handwritten notes, all attached with now rusted pins and tape that had turned brown with age. Jonathan's flashlight moved across them, picking out headlines from the 1940s. "War comes to Europe. London under siege. America prepares for war." But it was the photographs that stopped him cold. They showed families, black families, standing in front of houses at church gatherings, at what looked like community picnics. And in several of them, he recognized the background. It was his house, his yard. These people had lived in his house. "Look at this," Marcus said from behind him. He was holding a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed but intact. "It's a diary." Jonathan took it carefully, afraid it might crumble in his hands. The first page was dated April 15, 1943. The handwriting was careful, feminine. "We've finished the shelter. Thomas worked every night for 3 months, him and the other men digging in secret. The children don't understand why we can't use the public shelters in town, but how do you explain to a 6-year-old that the color of their skin means they're not welcome even when bombs might fall? So we built our own. We'll be safe here. We have to be." Jonathan looked at his brother, seeing his own shock reflected in Marcus's face. "They were excluded from the public bomb shelters," Marcus said slowly, as if saying it aloud might make it make sense. "During World War II, so they built their own." Jonathan continued reading, his hands shaking slightly. May 2nd, 1943. "The siren went off today. False alarm, they said later, but we didn't know that. We rushed down here, all 15 of us, from the 3 houses. Little Marie was so scared she wouldn't stop crying. I held her and sang the hymns Mama used to sing. Thomas says we did good, that the practice will help if the real thing comes. I pray it never does. June 10th, 1943. Mrs. Washington from 2 houses down says people are starting to talk, asking questions about the fresh dirt in our yards, about the lumber Thomas and the men bought. We've been careful, only working at night, but fear makes people suspicious. We've agreed to seal the entrance better, make it look like just another piece of driveway. Can't be too careful. The entries continued painting a picture of a community that had created its own safety net in the face of exclusion and potential danger. There were mundane details, food-stored repairs, needed children's games invented to pass the time during drills. And there were heartbreaking moments, the death of an elderly woman who'd had a heart attack during a particularly long drill, a child's fever that had nowhere to be treated but in the shelter itself. John Marcus said urgently, "Look at this." He was holding another photograph, this one clearer than the others. It showed a group of people standing in front of the shelter entrance, the very hole they'd just climbed through. But in the photo, it was properly constructed with wooden stairs and a proper door. And at the front of the group, smiling broadly, was a young girl holding the same teddy bear they'd seen on the cot. Jonathan turned the photo over. Written on the back in the same careful handwriting as the diary, Our Sanctuary. August 1943. Marie Thomas, myself, and the others who know what it means to build safety where none is offered. We need to document everything, Jonathan said, his mind racing. This isn't just historical, this is evidence of... He stopped, unable to articulate the magnitude of what they'd found. Evidence of survival, Marcus finished for him, of resilience, of a community taking care of itself when the country wouldn't. They spent the next 3 hours in the shelter, carefully photographing everything with their phones, handling each artifact with the reverence it deserved. They found more diaries, more photographs, children's drawings of planes and bombs, and families holding hands. They found ration cards, emergency supplies that had long since deteriorated, and a hand-drawn map of the shelter system that suggested this wasn't the only one, that there was a network of these hidden refuges throughout the neighborhood. It was only when Marcus's phone rang, his wife wondering where he was, that they realized how much time had passed. They climbed back up the ladder to find the sun already beginning its descent toward evening, and Mrs. Chen still standing at her property line, now joined by 2 other elderly neighbors. "You found it then," Mrs. Chen said. It wasn't a question. Jonathan approached her, dirty and exhausted, but energized by discovery. "You knew." "I suspected. My grandmother used to tell stories about the families that lived here before, about the sounds at night during the war, sounds from below, about how some folks in town didn't like that the black families had bought houses on this street, but those families stayed anyway, stayed and thrived despite everything." She paused, looking past him at the hole in the driveway. "Most people thought they were just stories, old folks' tales." "They're not stories," Jonathan said. "There's a fully preserved bomb shelter down there, built by the black families who lived here during World War II because they weren't allowed in the public shelters." One of the other neighbors, an elderly black man Jonathan hadn't met yet, stepped forward. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "My grandfather," he said softly. "He helped build it. I'm Samuel Washington. My grandmother was mentioned in those diaries you found, Mrs. Washington. She died when I was 5, but I remember her telling me about the shelter, about the nights they spent down there. I never believed..." He trailed off, overcome with emotion. "Would you like to see it?" Jonathan asked. Samuel nodded, unable to speak. As the sun set that day, casting long shadows across the broken driveway, Jonathan realized that he hadn't just bought a house. He'd become the keeper of a story that demanded to be told. The scraping sounds that had haunted his nights weren't ghostly warnings, but echoes of history desperate to be heard. The whispers weren't supernatural, but the voices of the past carried on the air that had circulated through those hidden chambers for 8 decades. That night after Marcus had gone home, and Samuel Washington had left with promises to return with other descendants of the shelter's builders, Jonathan sat in his kitchen. Their kitchen, really, because he understood now that this house would always belong partly to those who had come before. He opened the diary again, reading by the light of a proper lamp this time, and found an entry he'd missed before September 3rd, 1945. "The war is over. We're told we won't need the shelter anymore, that the world will be different now, better. Thomas wants to seal it up completely, but I convinced him to leave it as it is. Someday someone should know what we did here. Someday someone should know that when our country wouldn't protect us, we protected ourselves. That in the face of exclusion, we chose inclusion of each other. That beneath the fear and segregation and hatred, we built something beautiful, a community that refused to be broken. Jonathan closed the diary gently, thinking of the work ahead. The shelter would need to be properly preserved, documented, shared. The story would need to be told officially this time, not in whispers and rumors, but in museums and history books. The families who had built it deserved that recognition. He thought about calling Sarah, telling her what he'd found, but decided to wait until morning. This discovery felt too large for a phone call, too important for a text. He'd bring her here when she came home for Thanksgiving, show her the shelter, let her read the diaries. Let her understand that the house he'd bought wasn't just a fresh start for him, it was a chance to honor those who had come before, who had made their own fresh starts in far more difficult circumstances. Outside wind moved through the trees, and somewhere in the distance that same dog barked. But beneath his driveway and the shelter that had kept families safe through a war, and through worse through the everyday violence of exclusion and prejudice, there was only silence now. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of patient waiting. Waiting for 8 decades to be discovered, to be remembered, to be honored. Jonathan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the damaged driveway. Tomorrow he'd call the Historical Society. He'd call the local news. He'd begin the process of making sure this story wasn't buried again. But tonight, he simply stood there thinking of the families who had stood in this same spot, looking out at a world that didn't always welcome them, and choosing to build something anyway. The house settled around him with its familiar creaks and sighs, and Jonathan finally understood what Mrs. Chen had meant about the sounds from below. They weren't disturbances to be feared, but reminders to listen to. Really listen to the stories that houses tell. If only we're brave enough to hear them. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Hope. "The new house is treating you well, Dad. Can't wait to see it at Thanksgiving." Jonathan smiled and typed back, "The house has some incredible stories to tell. Can't wait to share them with you." He put the phone down and picked up the diary again, turning to a page near the end. A child's drawing had been tucked between the pages, a simple crayon sketch of a house with a smiling family in front of it. Underneath, in careful block letters, someone had written, "My safe place." Jonathan carefully returned the drawing to its place in the diary. Tomorrow would bring reporters and historians, officials, and distant relatives. There would be forms to fill out and procedures to follow. The quiet discovery would become public knowledge, and the shelter would transform from a secret into a monument. But tonight, it was still just his and theirs, the families who had built it. Tonight, he was simply a man who had bought a house with strange noises, and in seeking their source had found something far more valuable than peace and quiet. He'd found a truth that demanded to be told, voices that deserved to be heard, and a history that refused to stay buried. The cracked driveway would need to be properly excavated, now the shelter entrance rebuilt and reinforced. The Historical Society would probably want to create proper access, maybe even guided tours. His quiet, fresh start had become something entirely different, a responsibility, a privilege, a story that would extend far beyond his own. And somewhere in whatever place the spirits of the past reside, Jonathan hoped that Thomas and his wife, little Marie, with her teddy bear Mrs. Washington, and all the others who had sheltered below, knew that their secret was finally safe in a different way. Not safe from discovery, but safe from being forgotten. Their story would be told now properly, and with all the respect it deserved. The wind picked up outside, rattling the old windows in their frames. But Jonathan no longer heard it as the sound of an old house complaining. Now he heard it as the house breathing alive with all the stories it contained. And beneath his feet, beneath the floorboards and foundation beneath the earth itself, the shelter waited in its patient silence, holding its treasures and its truths for all who would come to learn. The morning arrived with a crisp October chill that made Jonathan pull his jacket tighter as he stood waiting in his kitchen, watching through the window as the first news van pulled up to his house. It was barely 7 o'clock, but word had spread faster than he'd anticipated. His phone had been ringing since dawn, reporters, historians, and strangers who claimed connection to the story that was no longer his alone. "Mr. Miller, The reporter was young, probably fresh out of journalism school, with an eager expression that reminded Jonathan of Sarah when she'd gotten her college acceptance letter. "I'm Rebecca Chen from Channel 7. No relation to your neighbor despite the name." She smiled, extending her hand. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us." Jonathan shook her hand, noticing the cameraman already setting up equipment near the damaged driveway. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to tell this story," he said honestly. "It's not mine to tell." "But you're the one who found it," Rebecca said, pulling out her notebook. "Sometimes the messenger becomes part of the message." Before Jonathan could respond, another car pulled up, a sedan bearing the seal of the Millbrook Historical Society. Dr. Eleanor Hayes emerged, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that immediately went to the hole in the driveway. She'd sounded skeptical on the phone last night when Jonathan had called, but seeing her expression now, he could tell she understood this was real. "Mr. Miller," she said, approaching with quick, purposeful steps. "I've brought a preservation team. We need to properly document everything before this becomes a circus." She glanced meaningfully at the news van. Samuel Washington arrived next, and with him came 3 other elderly black residents, all of whom had stories, fragments of memories passed down from parents and grandparents about the shelter. One woman, Dolores Price, clutched a folder of old photographs to her chest. "My mother," she said to Jonathan, her voice trembling slightly. "She was Marie, the little girl with the teddy bear in the photograph you found." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "Would you like to go down to see it?" Dolores nodded, tears already streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I've been waiting my whole life to see what Mama saw. She never talked about it much, but sometimes when storms came, she'd get this look in her eyes and say, 'At least we're not underground.' I never understood until yesterday when Samuel called me." Dr. Hayes intervened gently but firmly. "We need to establish protocols. This is a historical site now potentially eligible for the National Register. We can't have people just climbing down—" "These aren't just people," Jonathan interrupted, surprising himself with the force of his voice. "These are the descendants of the families who built this shelter. If anyone has the right to see it first, it's them." The historian paused, then nodded slowly. "You're right. Of course. But we'll need to ensure it's safe, and everyone will need to sign waivers." "I'll sign whatever you need," Dolores said firmly. "I'm 78 years old, Dr. Hayes. I'm not waiting another day." They established a system. The Historical Society team would go down first, ensure structural stability, then the descendants would have their time before the media was allowed access. Jonathan watched as professionals with headlamps and measuring tools disappeared into the hole he and Marcus had crudely opened just yesterday. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. While they waited, Dolores opened her folder, spreading photographs across the hood of Samuel's car. They were images Jonathan hadn't seen in the shelter: family photos, church gatherings, children's birthday parties. In many of them, he could see his house in the background looking newer, its paint fresh, the wraparound porch filled with people. "This was 1,947 inches, Dolores said, pointing to one photograph. "Mama's 10th birthday. They had the party above ground, but she told me later that all the children spent half the afternoon playing in the shelter. They'd turned it into their secret clubhouse by then, since the war was over." "Did she ever say why they sealed it up?" Jonathan asked. Dolores's expression darkened. 1954. After Brown versus Board of Education. Some folks in town didn't take kindly to integration being forced on them. There were incidents, threats. Someone burned a cross on the lawn 3 houses down. She pointed to another photograph, this one showing the same group of families, but their faces were harder, warier. "Daddy, that's him there, Thomas. He and the other men decided it was better to seal the shelter. Make it look like it never existed. Safer that way." Samuel added, "My grandmother said they had a ceremony the night before they sealed it. Like a funeral, she called it. Burying their safe place." Dr. Hayes emerged from the whole dirt smudged on her face, but her eyes bright with excitement. "It's stable," she announced. "Remarkably well preserved. The metal construction has held up better than we could have hoped. We've set up temporary lighting. The families can go down now." Jonathan helped Dolores to the ladder, holding it steady as she descended with surprising agility. Samuel followed, then the others. He stayed above, feeling it wasn't his place to intrude on this moment. But Dolores called up to him. "Mr. Miller, you come too. You're part of this story now." The shelter looked different with the LED work lights the historical team had set up. Every detail was visible now. The rust patterns on the walls like abstract art. The careful construction of the support beams, the way the space had been divided to give different families corners of privacy. Dolores stood in the center of the main chamber, turning slowly, taking it all in. "Mama was right here," she whispered, moving to a spot near the east wall. She said she always sat here during the drills because she could feel the vibration of the trees above through the metal, made her feel less buried. Samuel had found something scratched into a beam that they'd missed yesterday, a child's attempt at writing "Sammy was here, 1944." He traced it with one finger, his composure finally breaking. "That was my uncle," he managed. "He died in Korea in 1951. My grandmother kept his things in a trunk, including some toys he'd played with in the shelter." They spent an hour underground, the descendants sharing stories, filling in the gaps that the diaries and photographs couldn't capture. Jonathan learned that the families had developed their own communication system, knocks on pipes, that connected the shelters to the houses above. 2 knocks meant all clear. 3 meant come up quickly. A continuous drumming meant real danger, stay hidden. They practiced until every child knew the signals, Dolores explained. Even the babies seemed to understand that when they heard the drumming, they had to be quiet. Dr. Hayes was documenting everything with a digital recorder, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just letting the stories flow. At one point, she pulled Jonathan aside. "This is going to be big," she said quietly. "Bigger than local news. This challenges the narrative of the home front during World War II. It's evidence of systematic exclusion that forced an entire community to create their own civil defense infrastructure." When they finally emerged, the crowd had grown. More news vans, more neighbors, and a man in a suit who introduced himself as being from the State Historical Preservation Office. But it was the group of young people, students from the local high school, who caught Jonathan's attention. They stood at the edge of the property with their teacher, a young black woman, who was explaining the historical context to them. "Can they see it?" Jonathan asked Dr. Hayes. "The students." She hesitated. "We really should wait until proper safety measures." "These kids need to see this," Dolores interrupted. She had overheard and walked over grass and dirt still clinging to her clothes. "They need to know what their ancestors did, what we were capable of when the world told us we weren't worth protecting." The teacher, Miss Williams, stepped forward. "My students have been studying local history all semester. This would be invaluable." And so in small groups, the students descended. Jonathan watched their faces change as they emerged, the casual teenage indifference replaced by something deeper, more thoughtful. One boy, probably 16, stopped by Jonathan on his way back to the group. "My great-great-grandfather built houses," he said. "In this neighborhood in the 1940s, I always thought that was boring, just construction. But maybe he built more than just houses." "Maybe he did," Jonathan agreed. The day wore on a controlled chaos of documentation, interviews, and careful exploration. Marcus returned with professional excavation equipment, and they began the delicate work of properly opening the shelter entrance. As they worked, they found more evidence of the hidden network pipes that ran to neighboring yards, suggesting other entrances, other shelters. Mrs. Chen confirmed it that afternoon, finally ready to share what she knew. "My grandmother's friend lived 2 streets over, Chinese family. They weren't welcome in the public shelters either. The black families helped them build their own shelter connected to this one. If we can't be safe in their world," my grandmother's friend used to say, "we'll make our own world below." By sunset, they had uncovered 2 more entrance points, both sealed with concrete but clearly constructed with the same corrugated metal design. The network was more extensive than anyone had imagined. That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the historians had locked the site for security, Jonathan sat on his porch with Dolores, Samuel, and a few others who couldn't seem to leave. They passed around a thermos of coffee that Mrs. Chen had brought over, the October night crisp around them. "What happens now?" Samuel asked. Dr. Hayes, who had stayed despite the late hour, outlined the process. "We'll apply for historical designation, excavate properly. The state might want to create a memorial or museum. These things take time, but this is significant enough that I think we'll see quick movement." "I don't want a museum," Dolores said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. "I mean, not just a museum. I want this story told, yes, but I want it to mean something. These families didn't just hide, they resisted. They built community in the face of exclusion. That's the story. Not just the shelter, but what it represents. Jonathan thought of the diary entry he'd read the night before about choosing inclusion in the face of exclusion. What if we created something more? A community center, maybe. Something that honors the past but serves the present. With educational programs, Miss Williams added, having returned after dropping her students off. Bring kids here not just to see history, but to understand its implications for today. The conversation continued late into the night, plans and dreams mixing with memories and discoveries. Jonathan found himself at the center of it all, the accidental catalyst who had literally broken ground on a story that had been waiting decades to be told. Over the following days, the excavation continued under Dr. Hayes's careful supervision. They found more artifacts, toys, books, a hand-sewn quilt that had somehow survived the decades, its pattern still visible despite the fading. Each item was cataloged, photographed, its story traced through interviews with descendants and historical records. The network proved to be even more extensive than they'd imagined. 5 shelters in total, connected by a tunnel system that ran beneath the entire block. The Chinese family's shelter that Mrs. Chen had mentioned was smaller but showed the same careful construction, the same attention to creating a livable space in impossible circumstances. In one of the connecting tunnels, they found something that stopped everyone cold, a small shrine carefully constructed in a niche in the wall. It held religious symbols from multiple faiths, a cross, a Buddha statue, a Jewish prayer book, a Quran. Below it, carved into a wooden plaque, were the words, "We are different above but equal below." They created their own United Nations down here, Dr. Hayes marveled. While the world was at war above, they were building bridges below. A week into the excavation, Jonathan received a call that would change the direction of the entire project. It was from a law firm in Washington, D.C., Mr. Miller. The voice was professional, measured. "I represent the estate of Margaret Thompson, née Marie Williams. I believe you've met her daughter, Dolores Price." "Yes, I have. Is everything okay?" "More than okay, Mr. Miller. Mrs. Thompson, before her death in 2018, established a trust. It was to be activated only if and when the shelter was discovered. She never told anyone about it, not even her daughter. She left instructions and significant funds. She wanted to ensure that if the shelter was ever found, it would be preserved properly and its story told correctly." Jonathan sat down heavily in his kitchen chair. "How significant?" $2 million, Mr. Miller. Specifically earmarked for preservation education and community development centered around the shelter site. The news changed everything. With funding secured, they could move beyond simple preservation to actual restoration. Plans began to take shape for a comprehensive memorial and education center. The State Historical Board fast-tracked the designation process. Universities sent researchers. Documentary filmmakers arrived. But it was the small personal discoveries that continued to move Jonathan the most. Like the day they found a cache of letters in a sealed metal box, correspondence between the shelter families and relatives who had moved north during the Great Migration. The letters painted a picture of a community that stretched beyond Millbrook, connected by bonds of family and shared experience. One letter dated December 1943 particularly stood out. "Dear Sister, we received your letter about the difficulties you're facing in Detroit. The riots sound terrifying. It's strange to think that we might be safer here in our underground sanctuary than you are in a northern city. But we've learned something important. Safety isn't just about physical shelter. It's about community. It's about knowing that when the sirens sound real or metaphorical, you have people who will stand with you. We've built that here literally underground. Build it there above ground. Build it wherever you are." Dr. Hayes had tears in her eyes when she read it aloud to the assembled team. "They understood something we're still struggling with today," she said. 3 weeks after the discovery, with the main shelter now properly secured and accessible via a new entrance with proper stairs and safety rails, they held the first official gathering. It wasn't a grand opening that would come later after all the restoration work. This was something more intimate, a reunion of descendants, a reconvening of the community that had built these shelters. They came from across the country. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren, nieces and nephews, carriers of stories and fragments of memory. The local church, the same one many of the shelter families had attended, provided food. The entire block closed to traffic, becoming an impromptu festival of remembrance and celebration. Jonathan watched from his porch as Dolores led a group of children, her own great-grandchildren, and others down into the shelter. He could hear their gasps of wonder echoing up from below, could imagine them seeing what their ancestors had built, understanding in a visceral way that they came from people who had refused to be defeated by exclusion. "You did a good thing," Mrs. Chen said, joining him on the porch with a plate of food. "Some people would have just filled in the hole, pretended they never saw anything." "I couldn't have done that," Jonathan replied. "Once I heard those whispers." She smiled. The whispers were probably just the wind through the old ventilation system. The historical team found the pipes yesterday. They run all the way up to those oak trees. When the wind is just right, it creates a sound almost like voices. Jonathan looked at her in surprise. So there was a logical explanation. "There always is," she said. "But sometimes the logical explanation is that the past is trying to tell us something. You listened. That matters." As the sun set over Millbrook that evening, casting golden light through the oak trees, Jonathan stood in what had once been a hidden chamber of fear and exclusion, now transformed into a space of recognition and honor. The walls still bore the scratched words of frightened families, but now they also held new additions. Photographs of the reunion, children's drawings of what they'd learned, messages of gratitude and respect. Samuel Washington had brought his grandson, a boy about 10, who stood staring at the corner where the teddy bear had been found. The bear now safely preserved in a climate-controlled case that the Historical Society had provided. "Great-great-grandma Marie held that bear?" the boy asked. "She did," Samuel confirmed. "When she was younger than you, sitting right here waiting for the all-clear signal." "Were they scared?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "I think they were, but they were together, and sometimes being together is the bravest thing you can do." The boy nodded solemnly, then asked, "Can I come back? Can I bring my friends from school?" "That's the plan," Jonathan said, joining them. "This place is going to be here for anyone who wants to learn, who wants to understand." As the gathering continued above ground, Jonathan found himself alone in the shelter for a moment. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, a failed marriage, a search for a fresh start. Strange noises in the night that had led to all of this. He'd bought a house to escape his past, only to uncover a past that wasn't his, but had somehow become his responsibility. The metal walls reflected the LED lights in patterns that seemed almost beautiful, now not ominous, but protective, like arms that had held frightened families safe through uncertain times. He ran his hand along one wall, feeling the ridges of the corrugation, the spots where rust had been carefully treated and stabilized by the preservation team. "Thank you," he said quietly, to the space, to the families who had built it, to whatever force had led him to break through that concrete. "I'll take care of it, I promise." Footsteps on the new stairs made him turn. It was Dolores carrying a fresh bouquet of flowers, roses, like the pattern on the ceramic cup they'd found. "I thought Mama would like these," she said, placing them in a vase they'd set up as a temporary memorial. She loved roses, grew them in her garden until the day she died, even when her arthritis made it painful to hold the pruning shears. "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was. They all were." Dolores looked around the chamber, her eyes taking in every detail. "You know what she used to tell me? She'd say, 'Baby, we all live above ground now, but never forget that we once had to make our own light in the darkness.' And we did. We surely did." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people from different backgrounds, different generations, brought together by a house that had kept its secrets for 8 decades. Above them, the celebration continued. Music now. Someone had brought speakers and was playing songs from the 1940s, the Andrews sisters harmonizing about accentuating the positive. "Mr. Miller," Dolores said suddenly, "I need to tell you something. Mama left more than just the trust fund. She left a letter to be opened when the shelter was found. The lawyers gave it to me today." She pulled out an envelope, aged but intact, and handed it to Jonathan. She addressed it to the one who listens. "I think that's you." Jonathan opened it carefully. The handwriting was shaky. The letter dated just months before Marie Thompson's death. Asterisk, to the one who listens. If you're reading this, then our secret is secret no more. Good. Secrets are heavy things to carry, and this one has been carried long enough. I was 6 years old when my parents first took me down into the shelter. I was terrified of the dark, of the sound the metal walls made when they expanded and contracted, of the way voices echoed strange and hollow underground. But I learned something in that shelter that has stayed with me all 90 years of my life. Darkness is only frightening when you're alone. With others beside you, darkness becomes simply a place where you wait for light. And the light always comes. Sometimes you have to make it yourself with candles, with flashlights, with the spark of human connection, but it always comes. Take care of our shelter. Not because it's historically significant, though I suppose it is. Not because it's a monument to injustice, though it's that too. Take care of it because it's proof that people can build beautiful things even in ugly times. That community can flourish even in the spaces where it's not supposed to exist. That love is stronger than fear, always has been, always will be. I don't know who you are, the one who listens, but you heard us calling from the past, and you answered. That makes you family now. Strange family. Maybe the kind connected not by blood, but by story, by place, by the choice to remember. But family nonetheless. Remember us not as victims, but as builders. We built more than shelters. We built hope with our bare hands, with love and gratitude. Marie Thompson, asterisk. Jonathan had to stop reading several times, his vision blurred. When he finished, he looked up to find Dolores watching him with understanding eyes. She saw you, Dolores said simply. Somehow she saw you coming. That night after everyone had gone home and the shelter was locked and secure, Jonathan sat in his kitchen. Marie's kitchen, really all of their kitchens, and thought about the letter. He thought about the strange journey that had brought him here, the sounds that had called to him from below, the choice to listen and dig and discover. His phone rang. It was Sarah calling from college. Dad, I've been following the news. This is incredible. My sociology professor wants to bring the whole class to visit over winter break. They're welcome, Jonathan said. Everyone's welcome. That's the point. Are you okay? I mean, this isn't exactly the quiet, fresh start you were looking for. Jonathan considered the question. Through his window, he could see the new entrance to the shelter properly lit and secured. Tomorrow, construction would begin on the permanent structure that would house the museum and education center. His quiet life was over, replaced by something larger, more important, more connected to the world around him. You know what, sweetheart, I think this is exactly what I was looking for. I just didn't know it. After they hung up, Jonathan walked outside to the shelter entrance. The October night was crisp stars visible despite the streetlights. He could hear the wind in the oak trees, and yes, now that he knew about the ventilation pipes, he could hear how it might sound like whispers. But knowing the mechanical explanation didn't diminish the magic of it. If anything, it enhanced it, the idea that the shelter was still breathing, still speaking through the very systems designed to keep its occupants alive. A car drove by slowly, its occupants peering out at the house that had become famous overnight. Jonathan waved and they waved back, excited to have seen the man who'd found the shelters. He was becoming a minor celebrity, something that amused and discomforted him in equal measure. But celebrity wasn't the point. The point was the letter in his pocket, the trust Marie Thompson had placed in someone she'd never meet. The point was the students who would come here and learn that history wasn't just dates and battles, but people making impossible choices with grace. The point was the descendants finding pieces of themselves they didn't know were missing. The point was that sometimes, when you think you're running from something, you're actually running towards something else entirely. Jonathan had thought he was escaping his past, but instead he'd uncovered a past that gave his present purpose and his future direction. Tomorrow would bring more excavation, more discoveries, more stories emerging from the darkness into light. The network of tunnels still held secrets, and every day brought new descendants forward with fragments of memory to add to the growing narrative. The Historical Society was talking about making it one of the most significant civil rights historical sites in the state, possibly the country. But tonight, Jonathan simply stood in the doorway between past and present, between above and below, between what was hidden and what was revealed. He thought he could hear them. Not literally, he knew better now, but in some deeper way the voices of the families who had sheltered here, who had built community in the face of exclusion, who had loved their children enough to dig safety from solid earth with their bare hands. "I'm listening," he said quietly, to the night, to the shelter, to the past that had become his present. "I'm still listening." The wind picked up, singing through the ventilation pipes, and for just a moment it sounded like an answer, like gratitude, like welcome, like coming home. The November rain drummed against the windows as Jonathan stood in the transformed basement of his house, watching a team of archaeologists carefully brush soil from a newly discovered section of tunnel. It had been 6 weeks since the initial discovery, and each day seemed to reveal new layers of the story that lay beneath Millbrook's quiet streets. "Mr. Miller, you need to see this," called Dr. Patricia Kwan, the lead archaeologist the state had brought in. She was crouched in a section of tunnel they'd opened just that morning, her headlamp illuminating something in the earthen wall. Jonathan made his way over, careful not to disturb the grid lines they'd established for the excavation. What Dr. Kwan had found made his breath catch: a small wooden door, barely 3 feet high, built into what they'd thought was solid earth. "It's not part of the original construction," she said, running her gloved fingers along the door frame. "This was added later, maybe years after the shelter was built." Together they carefully worked the door open. Behind it was a space no bigger than a closet, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth and remarkably preserved, was a collection of journals different from the ones they'd found before. These were bound in black leather, official-looking, with dates stamped on the covers: 1955, 1956, 1957. Jonathan picked up the 1955 journal, opening it carefully. The first entry was dated January 3rd, written in a precise masculine hand. "The Integration Committee has decided to maintain the shelter system in secret. After the Supreme Court ruling, we knew there would be backlash. We were right. The Hendersons' windows were broken last night. The Washingtons found a burning cross on their lawn this morning. The shelters, which we thought we'd never need again after the war, have become necessary once more. This time we're not hiding from foreign enemies, but from our own neighbors." "My God," Dr. Kwan whispered, reading over his shoulder. "They used the shelters during the Civil Rights era as safe houses." The journal detailed a secret network that had evolved from the wartime shelters. Families fleeing violence in other parts of the South would be hidden here in Millbrook before being moved further north. The shelters had become stations on a new kind of underground railroad, one that operated in the supposed safety of the post-war era. Jonathan called Dolores immediately. She arrived within the hour, despite the rain bringing Samuel and several other descendants with her. When she read the journal entries, she had to sit down on an overturned bucket, her hands shaking. "Mama never told me," she said quietly. "She never said a word about this." Samuel was reading another entry dated March 1956. "Tonight we're sheltering the Robinsons from Alabama. Their son tried to enroll in the White High School. They barely made it out alive. The children are traumatized, won't speak. We've put them in the East Shelter, the one with the painted walls. Marie and the other children have been bringing them toys and books. Children heal children better than adults ever could." "Marie was your mother," Samuel said to Dolores. "She would have been 19 then." Dolores nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She went to college in 1957. Full scholarship to Howard University. I always wondered how a girl from a working-class family managed that. Now I wonder if it was connected to this, to what they were doing here." As they continued to explore the tiny room, they found more than journals. There were photographs of families they didn't recognize, identification papers with different names crossed out and new ones written in, and a hand-drawn map showing routes from Millbrook to various northern cities: Detroit, Chicago, New York, Boston. "They were forging documents, Doctor," Kwan observed, examining the papers under a magnifying glass. "Creating new identities for people fleeing violence." One photograph stopped them all cold. It showed a young white woman standing with a group of black families in the shelter. On the back, someone had written Ellen Hartley, 1956. "Our angel above." Jonathan recognized the surname immediately. "Hartley. The original family that built my house." "That's old Judge Hartley's daughter," Mrs. Chen said. She'd been drawn by the commotion despite the rain. "I remember her vaguely. She moved away in the late 50s, never came back. Her father disowned her, they said, though no one knew why. Now they knew." Ellen Hartley had been helping the black families operate their underground network, possibly providing cover resources or information. The journals confirmed it. She was mentioned repeatedly as EH, bringing supplies, warning of police investigations, even sheltering people in her own family's house when the underground spaces were full. The discovery shifted the entire narrative. This wasn't just about World War II anymore. It was about a continuous thread of resistance and mutual aid that had stretched across decades. The local news, which had been covering the story as a historical curiosity, suddenly had a contemporary relevance that made national headlines. 3 days after finding the hidden room, Jonathan received an unexpected visitor. She was elderly, walking with a cane, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She stood at his door in expensive coat rain droplets on her silver hair. "Mr. Miller, I'm Ellen Hartley. Well, Ellen Marshall now. I've come home." Jonathan stared at her, speechless. The woman from the photograph, the angel above, from the journals, was standing on his porch. "May I come in?" she asked. "And may I see the shelters?" As they descended into the shelter, Ellen moved with surprising familiarity, her hand finding the rail automatically, her feet knowing where the steps were uneven. When they reached the main chamber, she stood still for a long moment, her eyes closed. "I can still hear them," she said softly. "The children singing to keep their spirits up, the mothers humming lullabies, the fathers speaking in low voices about plans and routes and safety." She opened her eyes, looking directly at Jonathan. "I was 24 when I first came down here, a sheriff's daughter who thought she knew about justice until she saw what justice really looked like, families protecting each other when the law wouldn't." She moved to a particular section of wall, running her fingers along it, until she found what she was looking for, a small heart carved into the metal with EH plus JW inside it. "James Washington," she said, a sad smile crossing her face. "Samuel's uncle. We were in love. An impossible love. In 1956 Mississippi, even more impossible in the slightly less south of Millbrook. He was the one who brought me into this, showed me what was happening, asked for my help." "What happened to him?" Samuel asked. He'd been called as soon as Ellen identified herself and had rushed over. "He made it to Detroit in 1,957 inches, Ellen said. "We helped him leave after someone saw us together, started asking questions. He wrote me for a while, but it was too dangerous for both of us. I heard he died in Korea, but by then I was long gone too." She told them her story as they walked through the tunnels, how she'd started by bringing food and medical supplies, using her father's position to deflect suspicion, how she'd hidden families in the judge's own house when he was away on business, how she'd been caught eventually not by her father, but by her mother, who had given her an ultimatum: leave Millbrook forever, or watch everyone she'd been helping be arrested. "Mother knew about the network," Ellen said bitterly. "She'd known all along. She used it as leverage to get rid of me to prevent the scandal of having an integrationist daughter. I left that night. Didn't even say goodbye to anyone." "Where did you go?" Dolores asked. "California first, then Oregon. I became a teacher, married a good man who knew my whole story and loved me anyway. Had 3 children who grew up believing in justice because I taught them what I learned here in these shelters." She paused, looking around the chamber. "I should have come back sooner, should have told this story sooner, but I was a coward." "You were not a coward," Samuel said firmly. "You risked everything." Ellen shook her head. "I risked my privilege. They risked their lives. There's a difference." As word spread of Ellen's return, more people began coming forward with fragments of stories, half-remembered conversations, mysterious absences of relatives who had vanished in the night and returned with new names, new histories. The shelter network, it seemed, had been an open secret among the black community, never spoken of, but always known. Dr. Hayes arrived with a team of oral historians frantically trying to capture every story before the elderly witnesses were gone. The shelter had become a living archive, with people sitting in the very spaces where their relatives had hidden, recording their memories for posterity. One afternoon, as Jonathan was helping to catalog newly discovered artifacts, a young man appeared at the shelter entrance. He was probably 30, well-dressed, carrying an expensive leather briefcase. "Mr. Miller, I'm James Washington III. My grandfather was James Washington, the one who..." He glanced at Ellen, who was sitting with Dolores going through photographs. "The one who loved me," Ellen finished quietly. "You look just like him." James III had brought something extraordinary letters his grandfather had never sent, had kept hidden until his death in Korea. His personal effects had been returned to his mother, who had kept them without reading them, passing them down through the family unopened. "I thought it was time," James III said, handing the packet to Ellen. She read them silently, tears streaming down her face. Then she read one aloud, her voice shaking asterisk. "My dearest Ellen, by the time you might read this, if you ever do, I'll be somewhere far from Millbrook, maybe far from this earth. But I need you to know that what we did mattered. Every family we saved, every child who made it north to safety, every moment of hope we created in that darkness, it all mattered. They can make laws against us loving each other, but they can't make laws against love itself. What we built down there in those shelters, that was love. Love for humanity, love for justice, love for each other. Don't ever let anyone tell you different. I dream about after the world changes, after the laws change, after hearts change. I dream about walking down Main Street holding your hand in broad daylight. Maybe that's a fool's dream, but down in those shelters, we learned that sometimes fool's dreams are the only ones worth having. Be brave, my angel above. Be brave, and know that you were loved truly and deeply by a man who knew what love cost and chose to pay it anyway. Forever yours. James." The shelter fell silent except for the sound of rain above and the quiet crying of several people, including Jonathan, who had been moved beyond words by the letter. Here in this space that had sheltered bodies from bombs and souls from hatred, love had flourished against all odds. Ellen took James III's hands in hers, studying his face like she was seeing through time. "He has your grandfather's eyes," she said, "and his courage, too, I think, to bring these letters here to complete this circle." As the weeks passed and November turned toward December, the shelter project took on a life of its own. The state approved emergency funding for full excavation and preservation. Universities sent graduate students to help with the archaeological work. The Smithsonian expressed interest in creating a permanent exhibition. But it was the human connections that continued to amaze Jonathan. Ellen Marshall had moved back to Millbrook, renting a small apartment downtown. At 86, she said she wanted to spend whatever time she had left making sure the story was told correctly. She and Dolores had become inseparable, two women bound by a history neither had fully known until now. One evening, Jonathan found Ellen alone in the shelter, sitting on one of the restored benches they'd installed for visitors. The LED lights cast strange shadows on the corrugated walls, and for a moment he could imagine how it must have looked in the 1950s, lit by candles and kerosene lamps. "Do you regret it?" he asked, sitting beside her. Staying away so long. Ellen considered the question. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that we lived in a world where loving someone could be illegal, where helping people find safety was considered criminal. But no, I don't regret my choices. We all did what we had to do to survive." "The journals make you sound heroic." She laughed, but it was bitter. "There's nothing heroic about benefiting from an unjust system, even if you're working against it. I could help because I was white, because I was the judge's daughter, because I had protection they didn't have. That's not heroism. That's just doing the bare minimum of what was right." "But you risked everything." "I risked losing my privilege," she corrected. "They risked losing their lives. Never forget the difference, Mr. Miller. Never let the story be told as if we were all equal heroes. We weren't. We couldn't be not in that system." Her words stayed with Jonathan as the shelter project evolved. He made sure that in every tour, every presentation, every article written about the discovery, the focus remained on the Black families who had built and maintained the shelters, who had risked everything to protect their communities. Ellen and the other white allies were part of the story, but they weren't the center of it. The week before Thanksgiving, Sarah came home from college. Jonathan picked her up at the train station, and her first words were, "Take me to the shelter, Dad. I need to see it." They went straight there, descending into the main chamber where a small group of tourists were listening to Samuel give a tour. Sarah stood transfixed as Samuel told the story of his family, of the nights spent underground, of the coded knocks on pipes of the children who grew up keeping the most dangerous kinds of secrets. "This is why I'm studying sociology," Sarah said to her father afterward. "This right here. The way communities survive, resist, persist. The way people build power out of powerlessness." That evening, they held what would become the first of many community dinners in the shelter. Tables were set up in the main chamber lights strung along the metal walls, and families, both descendants and newcomers, gathered to share food and stories. Ellen sat between Dolores and Mrs. Chen, the three elderly women talking like old friends. James III had returned with his family, his children listening wide-eyed to stories of their ancestor. Marcus gave a toast, raising a glass of cider. "To those who built these shelters, who dug safety from solid ground with their bare hands. To those who maintained them, who kept the secret when keeping secrets could cost lives. To those who used them, who trusted in community when the larger community failed them. And to my brother who heard whispers in the night and chose to listen." "To listening," everyone echoed, and the sound reverberated through the metal walls, through the tunnels, through the decades of silence that had finally been broken. After dinner, as people began to leave, Dolores pulled Jonathan aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing him a small wrapped package. "Open it later, when you're alone." That night, after Sarah had gone to bed in her childhood room, Jonathan sat in his kitchen and opened the package. Inside was a small piece of corrugated metal, probably 6 inches square, with words scratched into it. The handwriting was childish but clear. "Thank you for finding us. Marie, age 6, 1943. There was a note from Dolores's. This was cut from a section we had to remove for structural support. Mama scratched this on her last visit to the shelter before they sealed it. She was 70 years old, dying of cancer, and she snuck down there one final time to leave this message. She told me about it, but I never believed her. She said she knew someone would find it someday, someone who would understand that they weren't just shelters, but testimonies. Thank you for being that someone." Jonathan held the piece of metal, feeling the weight of it, not just its physical weight, but the weight of years of stories of lives lived in the margins and finally brought to light. Outside, November wind rattled the windows, and yes, he could hear it in the pipes, the whisper of air through the ventilation system that connected his house to the shelters below. But now he knew what the whispers were saying. They were saying we were here, we survived, we loved, we built, we resisted, we persisted. Remember us not as victims, but as victors, not as historical footnotes, but as the authors of our own survival. The next morning brought unexpected news. The National Park Service wanted to designate the shelter network as a National Historical Landmark, fast-tracking a process that usually took years. There was talk of federal funding, of creating a permanent museum and education center, of making Millbrook a destination for people seeking to understand this hidden chapter of American history. Jonathan stood in his yard looking at the house that had started it all. It looked different now, even though structurally nothing had changed. It was no longer just his house, but a landmark, a testament, a bridge between past and present. The cracked driveway had been professionally excavated and reconstructed with viewing panels that allowed visitors to see into the shelter entrance while protecting the structure. Mrs. Chen joined him, as she often did these mornings, bringing coffee and companionship. "You know the strangest thing," she said. "My grandmother's friend, the one who was helped by the black families to build their own shelter. Her great-granddaughter is flying in from San Francisco next week. She wants to document the Chinese-American experience in the shelters. This story just keeps growing." "Like ripples in a pond," Jonathan agreed. "More like roots," Mrs. Chen corrected. "Roots that were always there under the surface, waiting to be acknowledged." Dr. Hayes arrived with a team of preservation specialists. They were beginning the delicate work of stabilizing the sections of tunnel that connected to other properties. 3 homeowners had agreed to allow excavation in their yards, and 2 more were considering it. The network, as they were beginning to understand it, might extend under the entire neighborhood. As Jonathan watched the work proceed, his phone rang. It was a producer from a major documentary company wanting to discuss film rights. He'd been fielding such calls for weeks now, but this one was different. The producer was Ken Burns's production company, interested in making the Shelter Network part of a larger series on hidden histories of the civil rights movement. "We see this as a crucial story," the producer said. It challenges the narrative that the North was somehow exempt from the racism that plagued the South. It shows how Black communities created their own systems of survival and resistance. And it demonstrates the power of interracial alliance, even when such alliances were dangerous or illegal. Jonathan agreed to the initial meeting, but only if Dolores, Samuel, Ellen, and the other descendants were included in every decision. This was their story to tell. He was just the person who'd happened to hear it calling from beneath his driveway. That afternoon, as autumn sun slanted through the shelter entrance, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the air, Jonathan stood with Ellen in the main chamber. She was teaching a group of high school students, telling them about the night in 1956 when they'd hidden 15 people fleeing violence in Alabama. "We could hear the police cars above," she said, her voice steady, despite the weight of memory. "They were searching house to house, looking for outside agitators. The families down here had to keep 15 children absolutely silent for 6 hours. Do you know how hard it is to keep one child quiet for 6 minutes?" The students laughed, but it was nervous laughter. They understood the stakes. "How did they do it?" one student asked. Ellen smiled. The older children told stories to the younger ones, silent stories acted out with their hands making shadow puppets on the shelter walls. They turned terror into a game survival, into art. That's what oppressed people have always done, taken the worst circumstances and found beauty, community resistance within them. After the students left, Ellen turned to Jonathan. "I'm dying," she said matter-of-factly. "Pancreatic cancer. I've got maybe 6 months. That's why I came back. I needed to see this through to make sure the story was told correctly before I'm gone." Jonathan felt the floor shift beneath him. Ellen had become such a vital part of the shelter project, her memories and insights invaluable to understanding the full scope of what had happened here. Does anyone else know? Dolores, Samuel, now you. She touched the wall where she'd carved her initials decades ago. "I want to be buried here. Not literally, I know that's not possible, but I want my ashes scattered in the shelter. Is that morbid?" "It's perfect," Jonathan said, meaning it. Ellen smiled. "You're a good man, Jonathan Miller. This house chose well when it called to you." As December approached, the shelter had become a pilgrimage site. People came from across the country, many of them descendants of families who had passed through the network during the civil rights era. They brought photographs, documents, stories that added layers to the narrative. One visitor particularly moved Jonathan. She was a middle-aged woman named Patricia Holmes, whose parents had been hidden in the shelter in 1955 when she was an infant. She'd brought her teenage daughter and elderly mother 3 generations, linked by a story of survival. "My mother doesn't remember much," Patricia said, gesturing to the elderly woman in a wheelchair. "She was only 2. But she remembers the singing, the people in the shelter singing softly to keep the children calm." The elderly woman spoke for the first time, her voice barely a whisper. "Amazing Grace. They sang Amazing Grace. When I hear that song now, I'm right back there feeling safe despite everything." That evening, spontaneously, someone started humming Amazing Grace in the shelter. Others joined in, their voices echoing off the metal walls, filling the space with the same song that had comforted frightened children decades ago. Jonathan found himself singing too, his voice joining the chorus that spanned generations. The shelter project had taken on a momentum of its own. Plans were drawn up for a permanent museum structure that would be built above ground, connected to the shelters below. The education center would include classrooms, archive space, and a community gathering area. Local schools were already incorporating the shelter story into their curricula, and universities were developing research programs around it. But for Jonathan, the most meaningful moments were still the quiet ones. Like the morning he found Dolores sitting alone in the shelter at dawn, talking softly to the walls, as if her mother could hear her. Or the afternoon when Samuel's grandson brought his entire basketball team to see where his great-great-grandfather had hidden freedom seekers. Or the evening when Ellen and James III sat together reading through his grandfather's letters, piecing together a love story that segregation had tried to erase. One night, unable to sleep, Jonathan descended into the shelter alone. He'd been doing this more often lately, drawn to the quiet of the space when no tourists or researchers were present. He sat on the bench in the main chamber, looking at the walls that held so many stories, so many secrets finally revealed. The ventilation system sighed with wind from above, and yes, it did sound like whispers. But now he knew what those whispers were: not ghosts, but history. Not hauntings, but memories demanding recognition. He thought about the journey from that first night hearing strange sounds to now, when those sounds had become a chorus of voices telling America a story it needed to hear. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Dad. "My professor wants to know if you'd speak at our university about the discovery, about what it means to uncover hidden history. Will you?" Jonathan smiled and typed back, "Only if Dolores, Samuel, and Ellen can come too." This story needs all its voices. As he climbed back up to his house, Jonathan paused at the entrance, looking back into the darkness that was no longer dark, no longer frightening, but illuminated with story and purpose. The house above might be his, but the shelter below belonged to history, to memory, to the families who had built safety in a dangerous world. Tomorrow would bring more discoveries, more stories, more connections between past and present. The archaeological team had detected what might be another chamber, possibly containing more artifacts. Ellen had good days and bad days, but she was determined to record every memory before her time ran out. The museum plans were moving forward with groundbreaking scheduled for spring. But tonight, in the quiet of his kitchen, Jonathan sat with that piece of corrugated metal that young Marie had scratched her thanks into. He ran his fingers over the childish letters, thinking about the woman she'd become, the trust she'd left the letter she'd written to, the one who listens. He was still listening. They all were now. And the shelter which had kept its secrets for so long was finally able to tell its truth. Not just one truth, but many stories of fear and courage, separation and community hatred and love, all woven together in the darkness below Millbrook's quiet streets. The wind picked up outside, rattling through the ventilation system, carrying its whispers through the house. But Jonathan no longer heard them as mysterious or frightening. Now he heard them as they were voices from the past saying, "We were here, we mattered, we survived, remember us." And he would. They all would. The shelter had made sure of that. The December cold had settled over Millbrook with an intensity that made the shelter's constant temperature feel almost warm by comparison. Jonathan stood in the newly discovered chamber, watching as Dr. Kwan's team carefully extracted what appeared to be a metal strongbox from a wall cavity. Ellen sat nearby in a wheelchair now, her strength fading, but her determination to witness every discovery undiminished. "It's locked," Dr. Kwan announced, examining the box under better light. "But the mechanism looks intact. We should be able to open it without damage." The locksmith they'd called worked for 20 minutes before the lock finally clicked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a collection of documents that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Freedom papers, some real, some forged. Train tickets. Maps with routes marked in careful detail. And at the bottom, a leather journal with "Property of Reverend Josiah Thompson" embossed on the cover. "Thompson," Dolores said, her voice tight with emotion. "That was my grandfather. Mama's father." The journal revealed another layer of the shelter's history. Reverend Thompson hadn't just been one of the builders, he'd been the architect of the entire network, working with a coalition of black churches across 3 states to create a system of safe houses and escape routes that operated from the 1940s through the early 1960s. Jonathan read aloud from one entry dated September 1954. "The Lord works in mysterious ways. What we built for protection from bombs has become protection from bombs of a different sort. The violence of those who would see us remain forever subordinate. We have moved 47 souls to safety this year alone. Each one carries a piece of our hearts with them north." 47 people in 1 year, Samuel said quietly, and that's just what he recorded. Ellen stirred in her wheelchair. There were more. Many more. Some nights every shelter in the network was full. We'd have people sleeping in shifts, children tucked into corners we'd made comfortable with quilts and pillows. She paused. Her breath labored. "Josiah never wrote everything down. Too dangerous. If the wrong people found these journals..." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a local story anymore, but evidence of a massive coordinated resistance movement that had operated for decades, hidden in plain sight beneath the streets of supposedly progressive northern towns. That afternoon, a delegation from the Congressional Black Caucus arrived for a tour. Representative Charles Williams, whose own grandparents had fled Mississippi, in the 1950s stood in the main chamber with tears streaming down his face. My grandmother used to tell us stories, he said, about kind strangers who helped them when they ran, about a night spent underground somewhere safe but scared. She never knew where exactly, but she said there were roses painted on a wall that a young woman had painted them to make the children feel less afraid. Dolores gasped and led him to a section of tunnel they'd uncovered the week before. There, faded but still visible, were roses painted on the metal wall. Beneath them, in careful script, "Beauty persists even in darkness. E.H. 1956. Representative Williams touched the painted roses gently. My grandmother was here. She was actually here. He turned to Jonathan. Mr. Miller. This discovery doesn't just fill in gaps in history. It rewrites history. It proves that the Great Migration wasn't just people fleeing. It was people being helped, being saved by organized networks of Americans who understood that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The congressman's visit brought new attention and, more importantly, federal resources. Within days, the Library of Congress sent a team to begin digitizing every document found in the shelters. The National Museum of African American History and Culture requested artifacts for a special exhibition. And quietly, the FBI opened cold case files on several disappearances from the 1950s, hoping the shelter records might provide answers to families who had never known what happened to their loved ones. It was during this flurry of activity that they made perhaps the most shocking discovery yet. Marcus had been helping to reinforce a section of tunnel when his drill hit something that shouldn't have been there, concrete, much newer than the original construction. They excavated carefully and found a sealed room, the entrance bearing a date 1968. Inside was evidence that the shelter network had been used during the civil rights movement's most turbulent years. There were photographs from protests, some showing faces bloodied by police batons. Medical supplies dated from April 1968, just after Dr. King's assassination. And most remarkably, a reel-to-reel tape recorder with several tapes still intact. The Historical Society brought in equipment to play the tapes. The first voice they heard was young female and determined, "This is Donna Washington, April 5th, 1968. Millbrook is burning. Not literally, not like Washington or Chicago, but burning with rage, with grief. We've opened the shelters again. People are afraid of what comes next." The tapes revealed that in the days after Dr. King's assassination, when riots erupted in cities across America, the Millbrook shelters had been reopened as a precaution. Families had gathered underground not to hide from bombs or segregationist violence, but from the potential collapse of social order itself. One recording particularly stood out. It was Reverend Thompson, now elderly, leading a prayer service in the shelter. "Lord, we've lost our dreamer, but we haven't lost the dream. We stand here in this place, our hands built, where we've sheltered the desperate and harbored the hunted, and we say we shall overcome still. Not someday, but today, tomorrow, and every day after, until justice rolls down like waters." Ellen, who had been silent during the playback, finally spoke. "I remember that night. I'd come back secretly for Dr. King's memorial service at the church. The official service. But the real service, the one where people could grieve without restraint, that happened down here." "You were here in 1,968 inches, Dolores asked. "But you said you left in 1957. Ellen's smile was sad. "I said I left Millbrook. I never said I didn't come back. James, your Uncle James Samuel. He was killed in Korea in 1966. When I got the news, I had to come back. Had to grieve in the place where we'd loved. Reverend Thompson let me into the shelter. That's when I painted the roses, actually. Not in 1956, but in 1968, painting through my tears." This revelation led to a re-examination of many of the shelter artifacts. Dates they'd assumed were from the 1940s and 50s might have been from later. The shelter hadn't been sealed and forgotten. It had been actively used, maintained, and kept secret for far longer than anyone had imagined. As Christmas approached, the shelter became a site of pilgrimage for families seeking to understand their own histories. One morning, Jonathan found an elderly man standing at the entrance holding a photograph so old it was barely more than shadows on paper. "My name is Robert Clark," the man said. "I think my father is in your shelter." The photograph showed a young black man in a military uniform standing with a white woman whose face had been deliberately scratched out. On the back in fading ink, Tommy and his angel, 1951. Jonathan's heart raced. They'd found references to a Tommy C. In the journals, someone who'd been hidden in the shelters after being seen with a white woman. The records suggested he'd never made it north, that something had happened to him. But the details were vague, deliberately obscured. Jonathan brought Robert down to the shelter where Ellen was giving what had become her daily testimony to a group of oral historians. When she saw the photograph, she went very still. "Tommy Clark," she said quietly. "Oh my God. Tommy Clark." She knew the story. Tommy had been a Korean War veteran who'd fallen in love with Judge Hartley's secretary, Catherine Morse. When their relationship was discovered, a mob had formed. Tommy had been hidden in the shelter for 3 weeks while the network tried to arrange safe passage north. But Catherine had been sent away by her family, and Tommy, heartbroken, had tried to leave the shelter to find her. "He never made it to the train station," Ellen said, her voice heavy with decades-old grief. "The police said he left town, but we knew. We all knew. They killed him. Probably threw his body in the quarry outside town. I'm so sorry." Robert Clark stood very still, absorbing the truth he'd suspected all his life. "Where is he?" he asked finally. "Where's my father's body?" It was Samuel who suggested they search the quarry. The water had been drained years ago when it became a Superfund site. If Tommy Clark's body had been thrown there, there might still be evidence. The search took 3 days with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. On the 3rd day, as snow began to fall, they found what they were looking for: human remains wrapped in chains exactly where Ellen had said they might be. The discovery changed everything. Now it wasn't just a historical site, but a crime scene. The FBI took over that section of the investigation, and although the perpetrators were certainly long dead, the case was officially opened as a civil rights cold case murder. Robert Clark stood at the edge of the quarry as his father's remains were carefully exhumed. 70 years, he said to Jonathan. 70 years of not knowing. My mother went to her grave not knowing, but now we can bury him properly. Now he can rest. The funeral for Tommy Clark was held on December 20th in the same church where Reverend Thompson had once preached. The sanctuary was packed not just with the Clark family, but with the entire community that had been touched by the shelter discovery. Ellen, despite her deteriorating condition, insisted on attending. She spoke from her wheelchair, her voice still clear despite her physical frailty. Tommy Clark died because he loved someone the world said he couldn't love. He died because he believed in a future where love wasn't legislated, where hearts weren't segregated. We failed to protect him then. We can't fail to remember him now. After the service, as snow fell heavily on Millbrook, the funeral procession made an unexpected stop. Robert Clark had requested that before his father was buried, the casket be brought to the shelter one last time. They carried it down carefully, setting it in the main chamber where Tommy had spent his last free days. Robert spoke to the assembled crowd. "My father found safety here, even if it was temporary. He found people who risked everything to protect him. That matters. It means he didn't die alone or forgotten. He died surrounded by love, even if that love couldn't save him." It was then that young Marie's great-granddaughter, a child of no more than 7, began to sing. Nobody had asked her to. She just began, her voice pure and clear. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. One by one, others joined in until the shelter that had once hidden frightened families now rang with voices raised in memorial and defiance. Jonathan found himself singing through his tears, thinking of all the voices these walls had absorbed. Whispers of fear, songs of hope, prayers of desperation, declarations of love. Christmas Eve brought an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 90s, accompanied by a younger man who turned out to be her grandson, arrived at Jonathan's door. She introduced herself as Catherine Palmer née Morse, the woman Tommy Clark had loved and lost. "I thought he'd abandoned me," she said, her voice shaking. "All these years I thought he'd left town without me. My family told me he'd never really loved me, that he'd gone north to find someone else. I believed them. God help me, I believed them." Jonathan brought her to the shelter where Ellen was sitting, despite Dr. Hayes's protests that she needed rest. When the two women saw each other, there was a moment of recognition that transcended the decades. "Catherine," Ellen said, "I wrote you letters, dozens of letters telling you what happened. Did you never get them?" Catherine shook her head, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. My parents intercepted everything. They sent me to live with relatives in Maine. I never knew. Never knew he'd tried to find me. Never knew he'd died trying. The two women held each other, both crying for losses that could never be recovered, for lives that had been derailed by hatred and fear. Catherine had married, eventually had children and grandchildren, but she'd never forgotten Tommy. I brought something, she said finally, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold ring. He gave this to me the night before everything went wrong, said it was his mother's. I've worn it on a chain around my neck for 70 years, hidden under my clothes, where my husband never saw it. She asked to be brought to the spot where Tommy had hidden, and there she left the ring on a small shelf someone had carved into the metal wall. So he knows I never forgot, she said. So he knows I loved him until the end. That night, Christmas Eve, the shelter hosted its first official memorial service. It wasn't planned. People just began arriving as word spread that Catherine was there, that another circle was being closed. They brought candles, flowers, and stories. Someone had set up speakers and played recordings of the testimonies that had been gathered over the past months. Ellen sat between Dolores and Catherine, the three women representing different angles of the same history. As midnight approached, marking Christmas Day, Ellen asked to speak. Jonathan helped her stand, supporting her frail frame. "This will be my last Christmas," she said, her voice carrying surprising strength. "We all know it, so I want to say this while I can. This shelter saved lives, but more than that, it saved souls. It saved the soul of a community that refused to let hatred win. It saved the soul of a nation by proving that even in the darkest times, there were people who chose light." She paused, gathering strength. "But it also cost lives. Tommy Clark. Others whose names we may never know. The children who grew up keeping secrets that no child should have to keep. The families torn apart by fear. We can't just celebrate the heroism without acknowledging the cost." She turned to Jonathan. "You asked me once if I regretted leaving. I said no, but that wasn't entirely true. I regret that any of this was necessary. I regret that we live in a world where shelters like this had to exist. But I don't regret being part of the story. None of us should." As Christmas Day dawned, Jonathan found himself alone in the shelter for the first time in weeks. The memorial items people had left created a shrine of sorts: photographs, flowers, children's drawings, military medals, and Catherine's ring, all testament to lives that had intersected in this underground space. He sat on the bench and opened a letter Sarah had sent him, unable to come home for Christmas due to exams. She'd written, "Dad, I've been thinking about the shelter and what it means, not just historically, but personally. You bought that house to start over after the divorce to find peace. Instead, you found other people's pain, other people's triumphs. But maybe that's what starting over really means, not running from the past, but learning to carry it properly. The shelter taught us that. Those families couldn't escape their present, so they dug deep and created safety where none existed. You couldn't escape your loneliness, so you listened to the whispers and found community. We're all living above our own shelters, aren't we? The question is whether we're brave enough to excavate them." Jonathan smiled at his daughter's wisdom beyond her years as always. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Merry Christmas, brother. Thanks for not letting me talk you out of buying that house." The steady stream of visitors continued throughout Christmas Day. Families who had no blood connection to the shelter but felt a spiritual connection came to pay respects. The news crews had mostly gone, the politicians had made their statements, but the real community, the one that had been built through this discovery, remained. Dr. Hayes arrived in the afternoon with news. The National Park Service approved the designation. The entire network will be preserved as a National Historic Site. They're talking about creating an underground museum that will connect all 5 shelters with the house, your house, Jonathan, as the visitor center. It was what they'd hoped for, but somehow hadn't quite believed would happen. Jonathan thought about what this meant. His fresh start had become a permanent connection to this place, this history. He could never just sell and leave now. He was as rooted here as the oak trees whose roots had probably brushed against the shelter walls for decades. That evening, as snow continued to fall, Ellen asked to be brought to the shelter one last time. Jonathan and Samuel carried her down in her wheelchair, her breath coming in short gasps, but her eyes still bright with purpose. "I want to record something," she said, "for the museum, for the future." They set up the recording equipment, and Ellen began to speak, her voice weak but determined. "My name is Ellen Hartley Marshall. I am 86 years old, and I am dying. But before I go, I need you to understand something about this place, these shelters. They're not just about the past. They're about the eternal present of human choice. Every day we choose whether to be the ones who build shelters or the ones who make them necessary. We choose whether to be the ones who harbor the hunted or the ones doing the hunting. These walls heard prayers in multiple languages, saw tears from multiple cultures, sheltered love that the law called illegal. They stand as proof that even when the world goes mad, some people will choose sanity, choose compassion, choose each other." She paused, gathering what strength remained. "To anyone listening to this in the future, know this. You too will face moments when you must choose between safety and justice, between comfort and compassion. When that moment comes, think of these shelters. Think of the people who dug them with bloodied hands, who maintained them despite the danger, who opened them to strangers because they understood that there are no strangers in the face of injustice, only fellow humans in need of shelter." Her final words were barely a whisper. Be the shelter. Always be the shelter. Ellen died 3 days later on December 28, surrounded by the families whose histories she'd helped preserve. Her funeral was held in the shelter itself, possibly the first funeral ever held in that space. It seemed fitting. She'd said she wanted her ashes scattered there, and the authorities had made a special exception. As Reverend Jackson Josiah Thompson's successor at the church performed the service, he said, "Ellen Hartley Marshall came to the shelter as a young woman seeking to do right. She left it as an elder, having done more right than most of us can hope to achieve in a lifetime. These walls that once hid bodies from bombs now hold her spirit, her story, her example." The mourners filed past Ellen's simple urn, each leaving something: a flower, a stone, a photograph, a memory. Catherine Morse Palmer left a picture of herself with Tommy Clark, the one where her face had been scratched out, now carefully restored. "So they can be together here," she said, "where love wasn't illegal, just dangerous." After the service, as people slowly made their way back to the surface, Jonathan remained below with Dolores and Samuel. They sat in the quiet of the shelter, feeling Ellen's absence like a physical thing. "She was right," Dolores said finally, "about being the shelter. That's what this place teaches us. Not just that bad things happened, but that good people responded. That's the lesson." Samuel nodded. "My grandmother used to say something similar. When the world gives you no place, make a place. When the world gives you no voice, sing anyway. When the world gives you no hope, plant seeds in secret gardens and wait for spring." As the year drew to a close, Jonathan stood in his kitchen, their kitchen really all of theirs, and thought about the journey from October to now. 3 months that had felt like 3 years, or maybe 30. The house around him was the same, but everything had changed. The whispers he'd heard that first night had become a chorus, a symphony of voices demanding to be heard. The shelter project would continue. Plans were already underway for the museum, the education center, the memorial garden. Spring would bring construction crews and architects, historians and educators. The story would be told and retold, analyzed and interpreted, becoming part of the American narrative. It had always been just hidden. But for now, on this last night of the year, Jonathan descended one more time into the shelter. He brought with him the piece of metal with Marie's childhood message scratched into it, the one Dolores had given him. He placed it on the shelf next to Catherine's ring, another artifact in the growing collection. The shelter was quiet except for the eternal whisper of air through the ventilation system. But now Jonathan knew what those whispers were saying. They were saying, "Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for digging. Thank you for not letting us be forgotten." "You're welcome," he said aloud to the empty chamber, to the ghosts that weren't ghosts, but memories to the past that had become present. "And thank you for choosing me." As midnight approached, bringing a new year, Jonathan could hear people gathering outside. The community had decided to hold their New Year's celebration at the shelter site, turning a place of hiding into a place of revelation, a place of fear into a place of hope. He climbed up to join them, emerging from underground into a crowd of faces, black and white, old and young descendants and newcomers, all united by a story that had waited 8 decades to be told. Dolores handed him a glass of champagne, Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, and Sarah, who had made it home after all, hugged him tight. 10 seconds to midnight, someone called out. As they counted down together, Jonathan thought about time, how it could bury secrets and reveal them, how it could separate lovers and reunite communities, how it could turn whispers into shouts and shelters into monuments. 3, 2, 1. The cheer that went up echoed across Millbrook, but Jonathan was certain it echoed below as well, through the tunnels and chambers, through the years and decades, reaching all those who had hidden and helped, who had loved and lost, who had built safety in dangerous times. The new year began with snow falling softly on the entrance to the shelter, each flake like a blessing, a benediction, a promise that stories like snow eventually come to light. And Jonathan stood there, surrounded by community he'd never expected to find, guardian of stories he'd never expected to tell exactly where he was meant to be. The January cold bit deeper than December's had, but the shelter maintained its steady temperature as construction crews worked to install the permanent entrance structure. Jonathan watched from his kitchen window as workers carefully reinforced the passages that would become part of the National Monument. 3 weeks had passed since Ellen's funeral, and her absence was felt in every meeting, every tour, every discovery. It was on a particularly bitter morning that Dr. Kwan called Jonathan down to the shelter with unusual urgency in her voice. "We found something behind the wall in the 5th shelter. You need to see this immediately." The 5th shelter, the one they'd discovered last, had always been different from the others. Smaller, more hastily constructed, with none of the careful planning evident in the main network. When Jonathan arrived, he found Dr. Kwan standing before a section of wall that had been carefully removed, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were 3 skeletons, 2 adults, and a child arranged as if they'd died sleeping. The adults curled protectively around the smaller form. But it was what lay with them that made Jonathan's blood run cold: Confederate flags, KKK hoods, and a journal with a swastika drawn on its cover. "This isn't what we think it is," Dr. Kwan said quickly, seeing Jonathan's expression. "Look closer." The Confederate flags had been cut up and sewn into blankets. The KKK hoods had been unraveled and rewoven into what looked like bandages. And the journal with the swastika, when opened, it revealed page after page of names, dates, and locations. It was written in German. Dolores arrived within minutes of being called, followed by Samuel and several other members of what they'd come to call the Shelter Committee. When she saw the remains, she gasped and grabbed Jonathan's arm for support. "We need a translator," Dr. Kwan said, photographing the journal pages with careful precision. "But from what I can make out with my limited German, these aren't sympathizers. These are refugees." The translator, a professor from the State University, arrived that afternoon. As she worked through the journal, the story that emerged was unlike anything they'd expected. The skeletons belonged to the Steinberg family. German Jews who had fled to America in 1938, only to find that America's prejudices ran deep too. The journal documented their journey from New York, where they'd been turned away from neighborhoods and jobs, to the South, where they'd hoped to find work in agriculture, to Millbrook, where they'd heard rumors of people who helped those in need. "Listen to this," the translator said, reading from an entry dated March 1942. "The colored families have taken us in. They who have nothing share everything. They who are despised show us kindness. We who fled the Nazis find ourselves hidden by those who face their own persecution. The irony is not lost on us. We are all untermenschen subhumans in someone's eyes. So we become human together underground." The journal revealed that the Steinbergs had helped expand the shelter network using engineering knowledge from the father's background to reinforce the tunnels. In exchange, the black families had hidden them when anti-Semitic sentiment rose during the war years. The Confederate flags and KKK materials hadn't been theirs. They'd been stolen from a rally and repurposed a small act of resistance that transformed symbols of hate into means of survival. But the final entries told a tragic story. The youngest child, Hannah, had developed what seemed to be appendicitis. They couldn't risk taking her to a hospital. Their papers were forged. Their accents would give them away. The parents had tried to nurse her through it, but infection had set in. The last entry, dated April 15, 1942, was brief. "Hannah is gone. We cannot bear to leave her. We will stay." Jonathan felt tears running down his face as he looked at the small skeleton still cradled between its parents. They'd chosen to die together rather than abandon their child's body, rather than risk exposure trying to bury her properly. "We need to contact the Jewish community," Samuel said quietly. "They deserve a proper burial according to their customs." The discovery of the Steinberg family changed the public perception of the shelter network once again. It wasn't just a Black history story or a civil rights story, it was an American story of marginalized communities protecting each other across racial and religious lines. The local Rabbi David Goldstein came to examine the remains and the journal. "The Steinbergs were mentioned in our synagogue records," he said after hours of research. "They attended services briefly in 1941, then disappeared. The congregation assumed they'd moved on, maybe gone west. Nobody knew they were here underneath us all this time." The Jewish community arranged for the Steinbergs to be buried in their cemetery, but not before holding a memorial service in the shelter itself. Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others gathered in the underground chamber lighting candles for a family that had died in darkness. The rabbi and Reverend Jackson performed the service together, their voices blending in prayers for the dead. It was Catherine Palmer who noticed something others had missed. "April 15th, 1942 inches, she said suddenly. "That's the same date as one of the first entries in Marie's mother's diary, the one about finishing the shelter." She pulled out her phone where she'd photographed the relevant page and read, "We've finished the shelter. Thomas worked every night for 3 months." "They weren't just finishing it," Dolores said, understanding dawning on her face. "They were sealing this chamber. They found the Steinbergs and decided to leave them undisturbed to give them the dignity of staying together." The revelation led to a re-examination of the shelter's construction timeline. The main network had been built in sections, each one added as need arose and resources allowed. The Steinbergs had likely helped design the expansion that would later hide hundreds of freedom seekers, their engineering knowledge living on even after their deaths. As news of the Steinberg discovery spread, it brought unexpected visitors. An elderly woman named Ruth Steinberg Collins arrived from California, having seen the story on the national news. "Heinrich Steinberg was my uncle," she said, standing in the shelter where her relatives had died. "We lost contact with them in 1941. My mother spent decades trying to find them after the war. She died never knowing what happened to her brother." Jonathan showed her the journal, translated now into English. Ruth read her uncle's words with shaking hands, learning about their final years, their gratitude to the Black families who had sheltered them, their small acts of resistance, their final tragedy. "They write about a woman named Grace Thompson," Ruth said. "She brought them food, taught Hannah English, held her when she was dying. Is she—" "My grandmother," Dolores said. "She died in 1987, but she never mentioned the Steinbergs. Never said a word." "The silence," Ruth said softly. "It protected everyone, but it also meant stories like this were lost." The two women, one Black, one Jewish, both in their 70s, stood together in the shelter that had connected their families in ways they were only now discovering. They would spend the next several days together, sharing family photos and stories, piecing together a friendship that had existed 2 generations ago. Meanwhile, the construction of the museum complex continued. The architect, a young Black woman named Amara Johnson, had designed something revolutionary. Instead of building over the shelters, she'd created a structure that descended into the earth with glass walls that would allow visitors to see the original shelter walls as they walked through the museum. "People need to feel the weight of earth above them," she explained at a planning meeting. "They need to understand what it meant to go underground to choose burial over exposure." But not everyone was pleased with the shelter's transformation into a monument. A group calling itself Heritage First began protesting at the site, claiming the story was being exaggerated, that it was an attack on white history. They held signs reading, "All History Matters," and "Stop the Guilt Museum." Jonathan watched them from his porch one morning, feeling a familiar anger rise in his chest. It was Samuel who calmed him down. "They're proving the point," Samuel said. "The fact that this story makes them so uncomfortable shows how necessary it is to tell it. Our families faced worse than protests. We can handle some signs and slogans." But the protests escalated. One night, someone spray-painted swastikas on the shelter entrance, an act of hatred that took on additional meaning given the Steinberg discovery. Jonathan found them in the morning, and immediately called the police, but he also called the community. Within hours, hundreds of people had gathered. They didn't just clean off the graffiti, they created a living wall of protection around the shelter, taking shifts through the night to ensure no more vandalism occurred. Christians stood with Jews, Black families with white allies, immigrants with natural-born citizens, all united in protecting this monument to mutual aid. The vandalism had an unexpected effect. It brought out stories from people who'd remained silent. A Vietnamese family revealed that they'd been hidden by Black families in the 1970s when anti-Asian sentiment ran high during the Vietnam War. A Mexican family shared how they'd been given shelter during an ICE raid in the 1990s, hidden in the same chambers that had protected freedom seekers in the 1950s. The shelter never really closed, one elderly Black woman said at a community meeting. We just stopped talking about it. But whenever someone needed protection, truly needed it, the community knew what to do. This revelation led to an FBI investigation that Jonathan hadn't expected. Agents arrived wanting to know if the shelters had been used to harbor undocumented immigrants, if there were recent uses they should know about. The community closed ranks, everyone suddenly unable to remember any specific details about anything after 1968. These are historical shelters, Dolores told the lead agent firmly. Whatever happened here after 1968 is speculation and rumor. We're focused on preserving the documented history from the 1940s through 1960s. The agent seemed to understand the unspoken message and didn't push further. The official investigation concluded that there was no evidence of recent illegal activity. The shelters returned to being a historical site, though Jonathan noticed that several families in the neighborhood had started reinforcing their basements just in case history needed to repeat itself. February brought unexpected warmth, and with it, a discovery that would complete another circle. Workers expanding the museum entrance found a time capsule buried in 1969, apparently placed there when the shelters were officially sealed. Inside were letters from the families who'd built and used the shelters, intended for whoever might find them in the future. One letter, written by Reverend Josiah Thompson, was addressed simply to our descendants, asterisk. If you're reading this, then our secret is no more. Good. We've carried this burden long enough. Know that everything we did for love. Love of our families, love of justice, love of humanity itself. We built these shelters with our hands, but also with our hearts. Every beam was placed with hope, every tunnel dug with determination, every room created with the belief that someday such spaces wouldn't be necessary. We don't know what world you're living in as you read this. We hope it's one where the color of skin doesn't determine safety, where love between different people isn't illegal, where children don't have to keep secrets that could cost lives. But if it's not, if you're still fighting the battles we fought, then know this. You come from people who didn't give up. You come from people who dug deep, literally and figuratively, to create safety in dangerous times. Use these shelters as inspiration, not to hide, but to remember that when the world says no, communities can say yes. When laws are unjust, love is its own law. When they try to bury you, remember you are seeds. The letter was read aloud at the next community gathering, and there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Jonathan thought about how prescient Reverend Thompson had been, how his words spoke to current struggles as much as historical ones. As winter gave way to spring, the museum neared completion. The glass walls were installed, allowing natural light to filter down into the shelters for the first time in their history. The effect was stunning. The rust patterns on the metal walls looked like abstract art. The carved graffiti became powerful testimonials. The small personal spaces revealed themselves as shrines to human resilience. Sarah came home for spring break bringing several classmates who were writing papers on the shelter discovery. Jonathan listened as his daughter gave them a tour, her knowledge deep and personal, in a way that made him proud. This isn't just history, she told them, standing in the chamber where the Steinbergs had died. This is a blueprint for resistance. When they tell us America was never great, we can point to these shelters and say, some Americans were always great, the ones who built sanctuaries in hell. When they tell us progress is impossible, we can show them these tunnels and say, our ancestors literally dug progress from solid earth. One of her classmates, a young white man named Tyler, seemed particularly moved. My grandfather was in the KKK, he admitted quietly. He might have been one of the people these families were hiding from. How do I reconcile that? Jonathan answered before Sarah could. You don't reconcile it. You acknowledge it. You own that history, and then you choose to be different. That's what Ellen Hartley Marshall did. That's what any of us can do. The official opening of the National Underground Shelter Memorial was scheduled for April 15th, the anniversary of both the completion of the first shelter in 1942 and the death of the Steinberg family. It would also have been Ellen Marshall's 87th birthday. As the date approached, Millbrook transformed. Hotels filled with descendants coming for the ceremony. Media trucks lined the streets. The Smithsonian sent a delegation. The president was scheduled to speak via video link. But for Jonathan, the most meaningful moment came the night before the official opening. The families most closely connected to the shelter story gathered for a private ceremony. They lit candles for those who'd died. Tommy Clark, the Steinbergs, Ellen Marshall, and the unknown others who'd been lost along the way. They sang the songs that had echoed through these chambers, spirituals, protest songs, lullabies in multiple languages. Dolores stood to speak, her voice carrying the weight of all she'd learned about her family's legacy. My mother, Marie Thompson, left money to preserve these shelters. But more than that, she left us a charge to remember not just the pain but the power, not just the hiding but the building, not just the fear but the love that conquered fear. She turned to Jonathan. You asked me once why my mother addressed her letter to the one who listens. I think I know now. It wasn't just about hearing the whispers from below. It was about listening to what those whispers were really saying, that we are more connected than we know, that our stories interweave in ways we're only beginning to understand, that the divisions they create between us are lies we can choose to reject. As the ceremony continued, Jonathan found himself standing next to Ruth Steinberg Collins and Robert Clark, whose family's tragedies were now part of the shelter's permanent record. They stood together, different races, different religions, different generations, united by a place that had both protected and cost their families everything. My uncle wrote that they were becoming human together underground, Ruth said softly. I think that's what's happening here now. We're becoming human together in the light. The official opening drew thousands. The president spoke about the shelters as monuments to the American spirit, at its best, the spirit that says we are our brother's keeper, our sister's protector. Historians place the discovery in context with other civil rights sites. The media broadcast images of the shelters around the world. But after all the speeches and ceremonies, after the crowds had gone and the cameras had been packed away, Jonathan found himself once again alone in the shelter. He sat on the bench in the main chamber, now protected by climate control and security systems, and thought about the journey from that first October night when he'd heard strange sounds. The whispers were still there, would always be there, carried on the wind through the ventilation systems that had kept hidden families alive. But now they were joined by other sounds, children on school tours, researchers documenting every detail, descendants finding pieces of their stories. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Still think you just bought a house to fix up and flip? Jonathan smiled and typed back, I bought a house. The house bought me a purpose. As he climbed back up to his home, the Hartley house, the Thompson house. Everyone's house. Jonathan paused at the threshold between below and above. The shelter had taught him that sometimes the most important stories are the ones buried deepest, that listening to the past could reshape the present, that a single person paying attention could unearth truths that changed everything. Spring evening light filtered through the windows of his kitchen as he made dinner, the same kitchen where families had prepared food to take to hidden refugees, where Ellen had stood as a young woman planning acts of dangerous love, where Marie had returned as an old woman to leave a message for someone she'd never meet, but somehow knew would come. Outside visitors still lingered at the memorial entrance, reading the plaques that told the shelter's story. Taking pictures, some crying, some standing in silent contemplation. A group of teenagers, mixed races and clearly friends, sat on the grass nearby, doing homework together in the fading light. They probably didn't realize the significance of their casual integration, how revolutionary their easy friendship would have seemed to those who'd built the shelters. Or maybe they did realize it. Maybe that was why they chose to study here at this place where the past insisted on being remembered, where the underground had been brought to light, where whispers had become testimony. That night, unable to sleep, Jonathan walked through his house, their house, and thought about all the feet that had walked these floors, all the hearts that had beaten within these walls, all the secrets that had been kept and finally revealed. Every room held stories now, not just his own, but dozens, hundreds of others. He'd bought the house for solitude and found community. He'd sought silence and discovered voices that demanded to be heard. He'd wanted to escape his past and instead became guardian of a past that wasn't his, but had claimed him anyway. Standing at his bedroom window, looking out at the memorial entrance lit by spotlights, Jonathan remembered Ellen's final recorded words, "Be the shelter." He understood now what she meant. It wasn't just about physical spaces, but about creating safety in dangerous times, community in isolation, hope in despair. The shelter network beneath Millbrook streets would continue to reveal its secrets. Just last week, they'd found evidence of another connected house 2 blocks away. Who knew how extensive the network really was? How many stories remained buried waiting for someone to listen to the whispers and start digging? But that was for tomorrow, next month, next year. Tonight, Jonathan Miller stood in a house that had become a monument guardian of stories that had waited decades to be told, connected to families he'd never known, existed part of a history that had chosen him as its voice. The wind picked up outside, singing through the ventilation pipes, carrying its eternal whispers through the house. But now Jonathan heard them clearly. They were saying, "Thank you for listening. Thank you for digging. Thank you for not letting us be forgotten." And from somewhere deep below, from the shelters that had hidden the hunted and protected the vulnerable, came another sound, not a whisper, but a certainty. Not a ghost, but a presence, not an ending, but a continuation. The sound of stories finally told, of secrets transformed into history of darkness, overcome by the simple act of bringing it to light. The house settled around him with its familiar creaks and sighs, but now they sounded like acknowledgement, like approval, like welcome. Jonathan Miller had bought a house with strange noises, and in seeking their source had found not just history, but purpose, not just stories, but family, not just a shelter, but a home. And in the transformed shelter below, where fear had given way to remembrance and hiding had become revelation. The whispers continued. No longer. Pleas to be heard, but promises to never forget. Carrying on the wind the eternal truth that Ellen Marshall had proclaimed with her dying breath. When the world gives you no shelter, be the shelter. Always be the shelter. The memorial would grow. More stories would emerge. The work would continue. But tonight, in the darkness that was no longer dark and the silence that was no longer silent, Jonathan Miller slept peacefully in a house that had taught him to listen, surrounded by the voices of all who had come before, guardian of their stories, keeper of their trust, part of their endless, enduring song.